Welcome to the recorded session of the Colorado Department of Agriculture Ranch to Plate presentation that took place on January 11th, 2022. In this presentation, you will hear from Mark, Hollis, and Julia, who are all staff with the Colorado Department of Ag. If you'd like a digital copy of this presentation, the additional resources you'll see presented here, or additional contact information to reach out to any of the three presenters, please reach out to Beth Dallaire, the Pueblo County Ag and Natural Resource Coordinator. She can be reached at 719-251-0245 or via email at dallaireb@pueblocounty.us. Now let's jump into this recorded session.
Such as custom meat processing, feed and fertilizer, and hydrous ammonia tanks and scales. And so with me I have is Mark Gallegos, who's our Deputy Director, and Julie Mizak, who is the brand new custom meat program manager, as well as wearing some other hats for us. So Julie's here with us to help answer questions that you may have regarding custom meat processing, as well as some of the legislation that passed last year that is in effect that you may have heard about just through your normal social channels. Considering we have kind of a manageable size room here, if you don't mind, can we do a quick introduction of yourselves, just who you are and who you're with, and then we'll go into our presentation.
I'm Art Unwin, and I live on 36 and a quarter lane out there, but me and my brothers and sisters own a ranch down at Kim.
Okay, great. Thank you, sir.
And I'm Rick Ludwig, and I'm just interested in what's going on with the processing things. Of the
Absolutely.
I'm also a beekeeper.
Oh, wonderful. Nice to meet you, Rick. Ma'am?
I'm Jocelyn Rafferty Kammer. I'm the poultry superintendent for Pueblo County.
Still are.
Okay.
I think we're in the middle of all that. And my job is I just try to help our kids facilitate butchering and taking care of their own birds. And
Great.
I raise my own, so I'm interested to see what this has.
Awesome, and we'll try and touch,
Okay.
feel free to touch on poultry questions,
Okay,
because this is, even though it's ranch to plate focus, we can talk poultry processing and sales.
awesome.
Yep, all day long.
I'm Clinton Wilson. I'm with USDA Wildlife Services, and I help ranchers with predators, getting their livestock, and help out all around Pueblo County getting animals with rabies and turn them over to the health department, checking on all that stuff.
Awesome. Great. All right. Well, thank you all for coming out. Thank you all for joining us on via Zoom or listening to this recording at a different time. So what Mark and I want to do today is go briefly talk about and provide an overview of the Ranch to Plate Act. And this presentation is geared for both ranchers and custom exempt processors. And so for today, what we essentially want to do is we're going to go over real high level what Custom Exempt Processing Act is, what kind of like the current state program does, and how that interacts with kind of USDA and federal regulations. And then I'll go over that, and then Mark's going to go over kind of what that Ranch to Plate Act did. This was legislation that was passed last year by the Colorado General Assembly, and really more importantly, explain what the act does and what the do's are, and also what the don'ts are regarding the Ranch to Plate Act, because we do know that there is a little bit of misconception of what this legislation will allow ranchers and custom processors to do. And so it's really important that we can provide that clarity, and that's why we're here today, and we want to thank Beth and CSU Extension for that. We want to talk about why this matters and why kind of compliance, not just with our state regulations, but why it's really important that we comply with these federal rules and regulations, why it matters to both farmers, or both for the ranchers as processors, as well as for consumers. Then want to talk really briefly about some funding opportunities for processors and ranchers. We're seeing a lot of stimulus efforts, both on the state and federal side, related to food supply, value chain, and specifically custom meat processing and for ranchers. So I'm going to go really high level on that just to kind of provide an overview of funding opportunities. And then we'll have plenty of opportunity to get into a real dialogue conversation, a lot of Q&A from you here in the room, those who have joined on Zoom. And that's where we'll have Julie and Mark as well, kind of help facilitate that discussion. So with that, thank you, Beth. I'll start with just a kind of high level overview of the Colorado Department of Agriculture's Custom Exempt Processing Act. So the CDA licenses and inspects custom exempt processors here in Colorado. We do this. They are not a USDA processing facility. They are not, the animals that go through those facilities are not USDA inspected. These are animals that are processed for the owner of that animal, whether that is wild game owned by a hunter or is a rancher who is processing one of their animals for their own personal use. We have state authority over this program. We license and we often inspect these custom processors. They're all around the Colorado. There's a number of them here in the Pueblo area. We inspect them essentially for cleaning, sanitation, and record keeping requirements that are defined in state regulation. It's also important to note that even though we have state regulatory authority over custom exempt processors, they still are subject to USDA inspection, and USDA has begun kind of doing some random inspections of custom exempt processing, not just here in Colorado, but across the country. So even though they are licensed with the state, they still could be subject to a USDA inspection. And as I mentioned earlier, we do sanitation, we look at storaging, we do record keeping. Another thing we do is we have a team of inspectors that do these inspections. They'll go out and often take environmental sampling. So they'll sample like the equipment and the drains and the tools, and then we'll take those samples, those environmental samples, and bring them to our lab just to ensure that, and just to make sure that there's not Salmonella, Listeria, or E. coli being grown. So think of it as almost like a health inspection type initiative, because we want to make sure that these custom exempt processors are properly cleaning and sanitizing their facility and their tools. And knock on wood, we've been doing samples now for about a year, and the results have been overwhelmingly negative, meaning that's a good thing. No Salmonella, no Listeria, no E. coli. That's a very good thing, which means our custom exempt processors are really keeping their operations clean and sanitary. And that's really key because we don't want anyone getting sick. So custom exempt processors also have to comply with the Federal Meat Inspection Act, or FMIA. That means that they can only process meat for those owners' animals. So again, you're a rancher, you go to a custom processor, they're processing for you. There are some rules and regulations from a custom exempt processor. They can only process, and for the animal's owners, they must label and package all the meat that they process for not for sale. So this meat cannot go into retail food establishments like a store or a restaurant. They can process what we call animal share agreements. So you're a rancher and you want to enter into an animal share agreement with 10 of your neighbors on one particular animal. That custom exempt processor may process that, but they have to record the names of the owners of that animal, all 10 of those owners, in their record. So that is a requirement of the custom exempt processor. The other thing that's really important to understand about a animal share agreement, or you'll also hear them called CSAs, Community Shared Agriculture, is that that ownership of those animals has to be established while that animal is alive. Ownership may not change hands once that animal has been slaughtered. And this is a USDA requirement in the Federal Meat Inspection Act. So this is a hard baseline understanding. So we want to make sure that ranchers as well as our processors are compliant with state and federal law, that if you enter into multiple ownerships of an animal, that ownership has to be established before that animal is slaughtered. Next slide. Great. So as I mentioned earlier, meat cannot be sold by the custom exempt processors to consumers, it has to be returned back to the animal's owners. Any meat processed at a custom exempt processing can't be sold to retail food establishments, both from the CEP or the animal owner, like the rancher. I mentioned that earlier. There is an exemption to this, which is poultry. Poultry is exempt from this restriction. Poultry owners can acquire a CDA license, and that would effectively allow them to process and sell up to 20,000 of their own birds to retail establishments and consumers. This is a result of law that was passed, I believe, in 2019. And it is compliant with the federal requirements or the federal laws in the Poultry Act. I'm butchering that one, but
Sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good. So with that one, essentially what the USDA says is, look, if you are an owner of a flock of birds under 20,000 of your own birds, you can process those, and those can go into retail food establishments such as restaurants and grocery stores. That's fine. You just now need to provide and get a CDA license, because we will then inspect your facility again for cleaning and sanitation. And there are also record keeping requirements that a producer would have to follow, just in case, God forbid, there's an outbreak. We have proper records. And so if that producer or the CDA or the health department has to do a trace back or a trace forward to identify where that outbreak came from or where it went, we have those records. But the bottom line is, if you are selling poultry, 20,000 of your own birds, you can produce those, you can process those at a custom exempt processing facility, right? Or just on your own, at a cost, you can get licensed as a processing facility, and then sell those birds into retail. Under 1,000 birds, you don't have to get licensed with the state of Colorado, and you can sell those directly to the end consumer, which would be done at a farmer's market or directly to consumers as well. And Julie, if I get something wrong, feel free to
I would just add
Right
that the 1,000 and under is no retail sales, direct to consumers only.
Yes, right, very important. So you can sell to, without a license, you can go to 1,000 birds, and you can sell to farmers markets and to consumers on farm, as you will, just directly to the consumer. You want to go to retail, you want to sell at a grocery store, you have to get a license with us, and that is a requirement from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Is they say, we trust CDA to license and inspect these facilities, because effectively you're operating a commercial manufacturing operation at that point. We will inspect them for the cleaning and sanitation requirements, give you a license, and then you're free to go to restaurants and grocery stores. Can't go to hospitals, and you can't go to schools. Okay. So let's see, we're on the next slide. So meat can't be sold. Oh, okay, sorry, the last bullet point here. There is something on the Federal Meat Inspection Act, or that basically the USDA requirements to talk about personal use exemption. And personal use exemption is going to be really important to understand here, because this is where we begin to understand some of the nuance with the Ranch to Plate Act, and it's slightly complicated. So essentially what the Personal Use Exemption Act does is it exempts a rancher from being a USDA inspected facility, if you will, if they process their own animal for their own personal use. And their own personal use is defined as themselves, their families, and any non-paying guests in their house. So you have people over, absolutely, but if you're operating a B&B, that'd be obviously a paying guest. So a personal use exemption allows basically does exactly what we want it to do, right? It allows a rancher to process their own animal in their own facility that's not inspected, and as long as they're using it for their own consumption or for their family. That's basically the personal use exemption. You can't use an animal share agreement. Remember, I talked a little bit about what an animal share agreement would be, which would be, you have, I go into an agreement with 10 of my neighbors on this one steer to process it, and we're all gonna get 1/10 of a share. And then I'm gonna process it myself under a personal use exemption. That's really not adhering to the spirit of what the personal use exemption allows for, right? It's really intended just for me and my family, not for me to sell 90% of an animal, even while it's alive, process it, sell the meat, and then because I'm keeping 10%, claim I'm processing this for my own personal use. It's really not aligned with the spirit of the regulation. This is something that the CDA has discussed with the USDA, and we got feedback from the USDA saying, yes, essentially that would be essentially a mischaracterization of a personal use exemption. So personal use exemption is allowed only for really the rancher and their family, and really should not be used, cannot be used in any sort of other kind of animal share or CSA agreement, business model. So with that, that's kind of a high level of what custom exempt processing does, along with a little bit of poultry mixed in there. And so on top of that foundation is really the Ranch to Plate Act. And we'll go to the next slide here. Great. I'll hand it over here to Mark to talk about what the Ranch to Plate Act did, and really, this was legislation that passed last year, what it allows for a rancher to do, a processor to do, and also what it doesn't allow them to do. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mark.
Yeah, so hi everybody, Mark Gallegos. So I'm going to go, like Hollis went high level over our custom exempt processing program and our regulations that align with the USDA regulations. I'm going to get specific into what the Ranch to Plate Act allows and doesn't allow. And I also want to carry the message of, okay, this is what a rancher and the owner of that animal can do and what they can't do. And it's going to be really important that we really try to communicate this out correctly. So high level, so the Ranch to Plate Act, what it did is it set out that ranchers are going to be exempt from public health inspections with their live animals. So when they sell to that owner of that animal, there's going to be a requirement that they are exempt from public health inspection. However, it does not change the CDA and USDA's oversight of custom exempt processors. So we still have the oversight of the processors and the processing of that meat. What it also allows or doesn't allow is that ranchers may not use, like Hollis talked about, use a custom exempt processor to process meat and then sell that meat to the end consumer who are not part of that share agreement. However, it's really important to note that share agreement has to be set in place while the animal is still alive, because it states that you can sell the meat of the live animal. So you have to establish all of these ownership interests prior to the slaughter of that animal. And if you are, or what it still allows, you can still use a USDA inspected facility. So let's say you do have this, a steer, there's 10 members, you're going to process it 10 different ways. Or you have maybe 5 members of that steer, but you go through a USDA inspected facility, it's USDA inspected, USDA stamped, has the USDA bug. Well, now that can be sold, that meat can be sold, it's been USDA inspected. However, without that, a custom exempt processor cannot sell the meat. You as the owner of that meat may not sell that meat either. Like I talked about earlier in the first bullet point, ranchers that are processing under the Ranch to Plate Act, they must disclose that they are not subject to the license of a public health agency, and that's the wording out of the act and the bill. And the Ranch to Plate Act talks about when and what messaging has to be delivered to the purchaser of that share of that live animal, disclosing that they're not subject to a health inspection. So there's some specific language and some specific ways of disclosing that information that the Ranch to Plate Act talks about. And again, you'll probably hear us saying this over and over. The meat and meat products from an animal processed under the Ranch to Plate Act cannot enter interstate commerce. So again, if it's processed under the Ranch to Plate Act, it's going through a custom exempt processor. again, that meat is intended to be consumed by the owner of that animal or their non-paying guest, so it can't enter interstate commerce. Something else that the Ranch to Plate Act established that ranchers may establish ownership interest in an animal as low as 1%. Many of us are probably familiar with halves and quarters of a steer, for example, or a lamb or whatever animal, but this establishes that you can go as low as 1% share per animal. Again, think of your CSA, your community supported ag type of cooperative agreement may allow for that, as long as, again, the ownership is, again, established pre-slaughter with the live animal. And if it's established under that, you need to keep really good records of who are the owners of that animal, all the way from the live animal, all the way to the processed and packaged product that's frozen and delivered to the owner of that. And again, the rancher will need to provide those ownership records to the custom exempt processor, because the custom exempt processor, when we go in there, we're going to take a look and see who owns that package of hamburger in the freezer. There's going to be either a name or an identifying number, and we're going to work it back to see, okay, who owns that animal or that package of meat. And along with that, though, this does not exclude ranchers from using a USDA inspected facility, because some USDA inspected facilities will do custom processing for a rancher. So it doesn't exclude that. We're just really focusing in on the custom processing side of it that's not USDA inspected. Again, like Hollis stated, this does not exempt ranchers from the private use restrictions under the Federal Meat Inspection Act. However, ranchers may not claim private use exemption to self-process an animal that is part of an animal share agreement. So you as a rancher cannot take that animal, process it yourself, and then say, well, this is part of the CSA for this group of people. That won't be allowed. So with that, I know that was a lot all at once. Kind of gets a little muddy and kind of deep in the weeds a little bit, but we can open some stuff up for Q&A after this. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Hollis, talk about why this matters.
Thanks, Mark. I think that, if there's one thing to understand, I know this is confusing, is what the one key takeaway you have to understand is if you're a producer and you're looking to sell meat to end consumers, if you do it through a animal share agreement, first thing, they have to have ownership of that animal before it is slaughtered. If that's the case, you can go through your typical USDA inspected facility or a custom exempt processor, because they're processing it for the animal owners. If you want to sell meat directly to a consumer that is not part of the ownership of that animal before it is slaughtered, you still would have to go through a USDA inspected facility. So the key there is the Ranch to Plate Act does not specifically allow a rancher to utilize custom exempt processing as an avenue to process an animal that then sells that animal to the general public, because that public do not have ownership of that animal. That is kind of the hook. That is the kind of the key that we need to install to ensure we are compliant with federal law in the USDA. Because again, the key is that anyone using meat, anyone receiving meat from a custom exempt processor have to have ownership of that animal before it is slaughtered. That's right there is kind of the main key point. And this is something that could have existed, did exist, and this ability before Ranch to Plate, right? Mark talked about a lot of quarters. As long as the ownership established before the animal is slaughtered, the custom exempt processing is a great avenue, great option. But if you want to sell steaks, finished cuts, that would need to go still through a USDA processing facility, even with Ranch to Plate. So why does all of this matter? Well, three main reasons, right? Food safety, consumer confidence, and then compliance. So why food safety, right? Colorado has critical industry standards that keep consumers from getting sick, right? We don't want people from getting sick. We want to make sure that people are processing at USDA facilities, that they're doing they're doing the proper inspections of the animals, both pre and post slaughter, that we are making sure that we are doing cleaning and sanitation, even if it's through a custom exempt processor. So food safety is key. Consumer confidence, right? Colorado meat is high quality and professionally processed. One bad public outbreak, if we have, can have a damaging impact, not just to a farmer or a rancher's operations, right, but also to the industry as a whole. So we really want to make sure that we have the ranchers and the processors understanding what they can and cannot do, so we can ensure that things are being processed properly, so we don't erode that consumer confidence through an outbreak of people getting sick. And then finally, compliance, right? Ranchers and processors we don't want them to inadvertently violate federal law, subjecting them to regulatory action. The USDA is aware of the Rent to Plate Act. We have seen something similar in Wyoming. They've probably seen additional legislation being introduced in other states, because look, every state's trying to figure out how to provide more processing opportunities, particularly for states that are not have a state inspection program. Colorado does not have a state inspection program. So USDA is aware of the Ranch to Plate Act, and they were very concerned. They want to make sure that it doesn't inadvertently have ranchers and processors fall under non-compliance with the Federal Meat Inspection Act. This would not be a good thing for that rancher. It would not be a good thing for any processor. Certainly not a good thing for our industry. And so we have been talking a lot with the USDA on this. We've been really doing a lot of industry outreach on this, just to help educate ranchers on the do's and don'ts that Mark went through, so we can ensure that we are not going to inadvertently have a rancher unsuspectingly violate federal law and get into hot water with the USDA. So that is the Ranch to Plate and the processing, the do's and don'ts of what we can do. And we'll circle back to this here and open up in our Q&A, but I'm going to switch gears a little bit, because we talk about, look, with the COVID, one of the impacts is the food supply, vulnerabilities of our food supply and the food chain, and particularly when it comes to meat processing. And so, quite frankly, there's been a number of initiatives to see how can we grow and expand processing abilities or avenues or options for our local ranchers. This is something local ranchers have been looking for and requesting for a number of years here in Colorado, because we all know that a lot of the processing facilities are booked up now 2-3 years in advance. Not very helpful. And so we are looking to see how can we expand our processing capabilities here in Colorado. So I want to highlight, not just for processors that might be listening to this, but also for ranchers, particularly if you're listening to this here in early January of 2022, kind of what are some funding opportunities for processors and ranchers, both on the state and on the federal level. And so let me begin with the state really quick. There are 2 programs at the CDA that are currently available right now. The first one is we're about to open up a second round of farm to market processing grants. They can be up to $150,000 per recipient. They're looking to issue, I believe, at about $1 million in this second round. They're taking applications now, and they'll be closing here at the end of February. And the award they'll be awarded on April 30th. And this is what they call the Farm to Market Infrastructure Grant. And this is eventually for producers who are looking for have a funding opportunity to expand our infrastructure. And so I'll just talk about this in context of meat processing. So if you're a rancher, you're a processor, you get USDA process, but you need storage facilities, or you need marketing, or you want to expand your infrastructure operation, by all means, please feel free to apply on the Colorado Department of Agriculture's website before the end of February. And again, we'll award, the award will be giving out on April 30th. We've had a number of, in the first round, we had a number of applications, and a lot of them were related to meat processing, which is a great thing to see. So a lot of requests for, additional storage, additional freezer and cooling, mobile processing units. So we are seeing there is that need and that request. And so hopefully we can drive some dollars for processing through the grant program there in that first bullet. The second one is a loan program that CDA will be setting up. There'll be $7 million in loans for processing. So people who are into the the processing side of the supply chain, and $20 million in loans for farmers and ranchers. And this will be a loan program. They're still finalizing the details, but it's roughly going to be about a 4% interest rate. They're going to start in mid-February. There'll be info on the CDA website coming soon. They're partnering up with a bank, I think, here in the local Pueblo area. The thing about this is 4%. I know that rates in general are fairly low. The benefit of this program is that it is going to have a high tolerance for risk, and also have more flexible lending standards. And so, look, if you are a pretty well established operation and you have good lines of credit with a lender, with a more traditional lender, you probably will see more favorable interest rate in terms. But these are for those that may not necessarily qualify for those loans. These are for producers that may need a little bit higher risk tolerance or need more flexible lending standards. Some of these loans will be backed by CDA. And so again, there'll be a $7 million for processors, anyone processing, not just meat, and then $20 million for farmers and ranchers. And so that's on the state side. And then of course, on the federal side, recently, as in this week or late last week, USDA has announced a $1 billion effort in improving custom meat processing for small and mid-sized processors. We don't know exactly what that is going to entail. They're focusing on driving processing away from some of the top 4 big processing companies in the country, and driving that down, helping farmers or ranchers realize a higher profit margin from selling to these large processing facilities. They're looking to increase training. We know that training here in Colorado and the country for good processors is very difficult, and so they're looking to set up training and a number of other things using this $1 billion. So CDA will be tracking this fairly closely along with CSU to see how we can utilize this opportunity to drive some of that funding when it becomes available here in Colorado. But right now, essentially, it's just a general announcement and more details to follow. Under the USDA, the Ag Management Services awarded $32 million recently for processing, and we're pleased to announce that 3 Colorado processors did receive awards, each of $150,000. And so that was really a good sign. And then finally, there is your standard Farm Service Agency lending at the USDA that if you're a producer, you're a rancher, that typically have the good resources to apply for some of those lending programs at FSA. We'd encourage you to continue to seek those as well as we look to drive and increase custom processing here in Colorado. So with that, I'm going to provide you, we have this PowerPoint, we'll share this PowerPoint, but here are some additional resources, including links when you get this PowerPoint to the Ranch to Plate Act. We provide the link to our custom meat website at CDA. You also should have this handout as well. And on it is a really good table, I'll point out here, if you want to learn, kind of figure out, you know, what you can and cannot do. Who you want to sell to, it'll explain to you, do you need to go through a custom exempt processor? Do you need a USDA facility processing your meat? And so this will give you a good overview, kind of flow chart, not flow chart, but decision matrix on what you can, who you can and cannot use as far as to process your animals, depending on your business model. And then finally, that last bullet point, I strongly recommend going to, which is the USDA guidance on processing firms and inspection permits for the Federal Meat Inspection Act. This is a really well put together document from the USDA. It explains things in fairly common language, simple language, and you get to understand what you can and cannot do from a processing standpoint and from a ranching standpoint. So with that, I want to thank everyone for listening into this presentation, and we're happy to open up for any questions you might have about custom exempt processing, poultry processing, funding, anything. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
So any questions from anybody for our speakers?
I'm guessing I'm okay.
Okay.
I'm gonna say that with a question mark. So we had a problem with our 4-H kids, when the whole pandemic happened. All of our large processors took away poultry. So our kids, most of these are kids raising in their backyard. They don't have a chopping block. They don't know the first thing about butchering their birds. So they would come out to my house, bring their birds, and they would learn how to butcher. And they would learn a little bit kind of like the, you know, like fleshing and distribution, kind of like if they were a beef kid, they would go through the what is it? I can't even think now.
We do like a meat.
Ultrasound, all that, where the kids kind of learn the quality of their meat and how it's being used and if it's good or bad. So we did that out at my house, and then the kids would take their stuff home with them. We did have some other 4-H families who wanted to support a 4-H kid and buy a turkey, because when you have 15 turkeys, what do you really do with that many? So I'm hoping we're okay, but I don't think we hit 1,000. I think we hit 200 maybe. So
Yep.
I was a little worried about my kids because it's just kind of,
Sure.
there's no place for them to go, but I would need to be certified potentially, you think? Or take a class, or how would I help them?
So I mean, as long as you're under 1,000 birds, you're gonna be just fine,
Okay.
right? And it's even questionable, like I would even say, that's the sale of 1,000 birds, right? So
Okay.
you bring, you know, little Susie comes in, processes the birds, takes them home with her. She's not selling the birds. That's fine,
Okay,
no problem whatsoever. It's just if you were to sell those birds, so you sell,
we did
Susie
sell.
processes 15 of them, and you know what, we're gonna sell a couple of these to friends and family, as long as you're under 1,000. Susie's under 1,000.
The
We're
direct
okay.
end consumer.
Yeah, to the
Okay.
direct consumer.
Consumer.
There are some labeling and
Okay,
record keeping requirements. though.
okay, so we failed on that.
Yeah, and we'll get you those.
Okay,
Here,
thank you.
those are fairly easy.
I will add that the owner of the bird has to be the processor. So if Susie owns the bird and she brings it to your house, you can instruct her how to do that. And,
Okay.
But she has to be present. She can't just drop off 10 birds and say, I'll be back tomorrow to pick these up. Because now you've become a custom exempt processor and have to be. And have the
Okay.
license.
Oh, no, these kids have to stay the whole time, trust me.
Here's 10 turkeys.
So, and I misspoke a little bit, even custom exempt processors for poultry have to own the birds.
Okay,
So even if you go up to 20,000 and get licensed through CDA to be a custom exempt poultry processor, you can only process your own birds, the ones you own.
okay,
So as long as the kids are present and you're teaching them, no worries, you're good.
okay. That's all I want to make sure is my kids are okay.
Yeah.
And they need to be present to learn.
They do, they
That's
really
right.
do. They have no idea. Just simple stuff like, why don't you put a chicken on their back? Well, their lungs are on their back. They can't breathe. That's why they're all shutting their eyes and passing out. I mean, just. So, yeah, no, I like having the kids there. It's a fun day. It's really fun.
And I'll get your contact information and send you some information on the labeling part.
Okay. Good, yeah, we'll be better at that.
I'd like the record information also.
On poultry or
On
beef or
poultry.
both? Okay,
Poultry, yeah, I've got turkeys also.
Right.
okay.
Is that something we could keep that
Absolutely,
as
you can
well?
give it to me and then I can keep it on file since I contact most of you quite
Right.
frequently, some of you.
I'll be in to see you.
Yeah, we can definitely do that for sure. And if you all want the slides, if you'll write on your little survey, just put your email on one of those slots and say, I want the slides, and that way I can email it to you directly. That way, like if you want to click on any of their links for the additional resources and things like that, they can just send it to you directly and you can go through it at your own pace. So let me know and I can get that to you. So. With that, I know talking with a lot of people up in like the mountain areas yesterday about this, a lot of them are very worried about if this has any impact processing wild game or anything like that. So can you guys kind of speak to that or like kind of just put maybe some of their concerns?
The Ranch to Plate Act has no direct effect on the wild game processing. So wild game processing can be done by the hunter for his own animal, or the hunter can take it to a custom exempt processor with the correct records. But Ranch to Plate Act did not alter anything for wild game.
So then Julie, let me take that and just play a little devil's advocate
Okay.
here, but okay, so I'm a rancher. But, does this not allow me if I score an elk and I take it to custom exempt processor, score an elk, I want to sell those elk steaks online,
So no wild game can be sold on in retail
right?
avenues.
So the key is that Ranch to Plate does not allow for wild game to be sold retail.
Yes.
Thank you. That way, just in case anyone watches this later, it was kind of a topic I heard over and over
Yeah.
again
Yep.
with some of the discussions that was happening. So.
I mean, really, the Ranch to Plate Act does two things that didn't already exist with current custom exempt processing regulation. One, it clarified the allowance that its animal share agreement scheme can go down to, can go down to as low as the 1%, right? So they can technically sell ownerships of animals beyond just those quarters. So there's that. The other thing it would do is it allows for, look, I'm the rancher and I'm processing an animal share agreement, or I process an animal and it goes through a USDA facility to still be processed. I then bring it back to my operation and then I'm selling it online, right? Whether it went through a custom exempt processor as a CSA or through USDA, it exempts them from the public health oversight, public health agency oversight. So your local county public health department or your CDPHE health department, they're exempt out of from their regulation. And that was to Mark's point earlier, but not USDA regulation and not CDA regulation. We are not public health agencies like CDPHE or Pueblo County Health Department, right? So they're the ones that are exempt from going onto that farm or that ranch and conducting an inspection. But who processes it and the ownership animals, it still is into effect with custom exempt regulation and the ranch.
And that's why it's important to keep the records so that we can establish and work it back. We see a package of hamburger with, it just says, 124. We can go back with that number and track the records back all the way to the brand inspection and see when did title transfer. And we'll want to make sure that title transferred prior to the slaughter of the animal. So we keep harping on records.
As a consumer, what kind of a record would I have to keep if I bought an animal?
I don't think there are any requirements for the consumer themselves. You just wouldn't want to sell that meat if you went through a custom exempt processor.
Mhm.
That would be key.
Yeah, but if I bought it for myself.
Yeah.
versus
Yeah, I mean, you
trying to
buy,
sell it by
right.
process.
Yeah, because it really falls under the kind of who has, who, look at the two regulatory authorities here, CDA, USDA. We regulate the processors, right? And to some extent, maybe the rancher on the USDA side. Consumers, you're not regulated, you're not licensed, so there's no requirements. Be good to have ownership records, obviously.
Okay.
Most time, like when I get mine, I just write a check and in the memo will steer. That's my record, but that's me personally.
Okay.
I know a lot of people that weren't able to attend today, but a lot of them were confused about that definition of non-paying, because they said, for example, well, I process a steer, but then my neighbor Bob, I give him some meat, but he doesn't pay for it. Where is all that? Where does that fit into all of this? Because they're not paying for it there, but it is being given to someone else. So how does that fit into all of this? There was a bit of discussion about that.
Sure,
Mm.
that's a good question.
As long as Bob is a non-paying family guest, then that's allowed under the personal exemption.
Okay. Is
So,
there a,
but if he barters or payment in kind, that's a form of payment, and now it's a commercial transaction and has to have the proper records.
thank you, because I know a lot of people did bring up the bartering system, and there was
Yeah.
a couple discussions about that.
I mean, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn. We know this goes on, right?
Right.
I mean, it does.
Yeah.
USDA would say, yes, we understand. This is how things work, right?
I know
If
Troy
you're-
Moore happens here.
Right, if you're operating, a business operation predicated on using a custom exempt processor, so it's not USDA inspected, and looking to move a good chunk of a product into a retail or to consumers, again, that's not USDA inspected, that's where you're gonna get into trouble. That's where you're gonna get in a foul, right? You're that farmer, you're a rancher, and you're not you're giving it to your neighbor down the road. That's
Right,
what's gonna happen there, right? Who's gonna,
right, yeah. Exactly.
so, but really, I think what you want to be looking out for is if you're gonna actually build these business models where you're gonna, this is where you're trying to drive through. And here's the thing, a little bit about this, sorry, I'm digressing a little bit, but online sales and the effectiveness of online sales is really has a potential to be a game changer. As well as something that I think that quite frankly, the FDA and the USDA and people who are involved in food safety are really concerned about, because now you have through online sales and, shipping and packaging, the ability to develop a customer base and sell meat products. And so it's very enticing for somebody, a rancher or someone else and wanting to get into this business of processing animals and selling them, sell their grass fed or sell their unique niche online to direct to consumers. And that makes sense. If you want to do that, that's fine. If you're going to use if you're going to use a custom exempt processor to do that, you have to sell that animal ownership before it's sold, before it's slaughtered. I mean, that's just the key.
Yeah.
Still go through USDA. You go through a USDA inspected facility all day long. Go ahead, sell it online, right? Nothing wrong with that. But that's kind of the game changer, I think, here. And I think it's a lot of potential. But here again in Colorado, we want to make sure that we all understand kind of the do's and don'ts and what we can and cannot do. It's a little tricky, but we have to figure this out to build that model, because the last thing we want to do again is see a rancher inadvertently get crosswise with the USDA.
Any other burning questions or anything from the audience? I just have one more that a producer just asked me to ask. It's just they'd heard about Ranch to Plate, but they hadn't heard too much about as far as like the consequences and what that looks like. And is that a fine? Is that some people were hearing jail time thrown around? So I feel like there's a lot of rumors kind of going around with not a lot of clarification. So if y'all can just speak to that, and that way we do have it as a reference for.
Do you know what the federal penalties are? Because it would fall under the Federal Meat Inspection Act.
Correct.
Sale
Yeah,
of meat.
I do not know what those penalties would be.
Right.
Okay.
I would say this, so from a state perspective, so first of all, again, we spoke earlier about jurisdiction. CDA, the Colorado Department of Agriculture, does not have any regulatory authority over a rancher. Okay, we are regulating that custom meat processor.
Yeah.
And so we are going in there to say, we're looking at your records. Are you processing for the owners of the animal? You know, and so even there, you know, we educate before regulate, so to speak. And so we see something very minor, we see some non-compliance with Ranch to Plate from a processor. That is essentially just kind of a discussion, like I wouldn't even say official warning. This would be a discussion, maybe then a follow-up investigation or inspection in a couple of months. Repeat offending might then lead you to a fine. Worst case scenario, something really egregious, like extremely egregious, which I've never seen in my 7 years and probably in your 20 years, would revoke the license. Jail time, we don't have that authority. But that's on the state side. And again, this is only for the processors, not the ranchers. Ranchers potentially could be subject to violating the Federal Meat Inspection Act. And then again, that would be then falling under the jurisdiction of USDA. I highly doubt they would be following into jail time. I think that's
Well,
a bridge too far.
There was a recent case I think a lot of ranchers might be aware of. It was back east, and it was a rancher, but that rancher I think had ample opportunities time after time after time to be in compliance, and they chose not to. And I think USDA took some pretty severe and probably appropriate regulatory action against that person. So that might be what they're referencing, but they do have the authority to go well beyond what we do. But I'm sure that they are like us and educate,
Yeah.
work with
Yeah.
people as much as possible before they get to that level.
Yeah, not to speak for the USDA, but we
Yeah.
work a lot with other federal agencies, and just the general philosophy of the general regulatory philosophy for state and federal agencies is education first, you know, low level corrective actions such as a warning letter versus anything formal.
But please don't do anything where you do end up in jail.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you all for listening online, or if you are watching this later on our YouTube page. We appreciate it. And of course, we'll have contact info, the PowerPoint presentation, and various other resources. So if you ever do have a direct question and you want to get in touch with these folks, I'm sure they will give you their contact info. And if you lose it, you can reach out to the office. I'll have it on file, and I can easily just send you their way. So no worries either way if you're bad at losing stuff. So well, thank you all. We'll stop recording and. Thanks for watching this recorded session. Again, if you need additional resources, a digital copy of this presentation, or would like to contact any of the speakers you've heard, please use the information you see on this screen to contact the Agriculture and Natural Resource Coordinator, Beth Dallaire. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation and look forward to seeing you at our next in-person class for any agriculture and natural resource events we host. Thanks for watching.